Welcome to the Danger Close podcast. Thank you for tuning in to this special series on the 1983 Beirut Marine Barracks bombing to complement my first work of nonfiction, titled Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror, written with military historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist James Scott. It hits shelves on September 24th and is available for pre-order now in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, narrated by Ray Porter. James Scott joins me to co-host this podcast series. Our guest today is Dr. Jimmy Ware. Dr. Jimmy Ware was one of two dentists in Beirut. The other was Dr. Gil Bigelow. Jimmy was also best friends with Dr. John Hudson, whose premonition about the mission prompted him to enlist the two dentists in his mass casualty plan. On the morning of the bombing, unaware that their friend and colleague, Dr. John Hudson, had been killed, Dr. Ware and Dr. Bigelow stepped up and rose to the occasion, leading the medical rescue efforts. The bombing of the Marine Barracks and Headquarters building on October 23, 1983, was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history and resulted in the greatest single-day loss of life for the United States Marine Corps since the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II. It claimed the lives of 220 Marines, 18 sailors, and 3 soldiers. This is his story. The 25-year-old Navy dental technician had spent much of the morning helping dig out the wounded and administering first aid. He approached Dr. Ware that afternoon. "Lieutenant," he asked, "what do you need me to do?" Ware had a big job for him, one that would prove vital in the days ahead as technicians in Germany struggled to identify the remains of the deceased. "I've got to get the dental records out," Ware told him, "so we've got to get some identification. Those records have been stored in the basement of the battalion landing team headquarters. If the files even survived the bombing and subsequent fires, finding them would require tunneling down through the unstable rubble."
You know, for me, and I'd love to just talk a little bit about your path. What led you to the military, and then specifically to Lebanon in 1983? What was that path?
So my dad was a dentist, and he passed away when I was in dental school. And my wife and I were married at the time, my second year. Said, we're going to go back to Savannah, my hometown, which is where I live at now. And I said, you know what? My dad was also in the Army, and he was retired as a colonel in the reserves, and had been in the Second World War and during the Koreatown conflict, and then stayed in. But so I had a sense of duty, and I said, you know what? But I'm not going to join the Army. I'm going to join the Navy because I want to be near water. And basically, that is the gist of why I picked the Navy over the Air Force or the Army, and that allowed me to travel the world, I thought, with my wife, which it did ultimately because of my travels with all my Navy duty stations. So that is where I got into the Navy. The interesting thing is when the detailer told me, "Hey, we're going to send you to Jacksonville," I said, "That is great. That is so close to my hometown. I still have family there." But it didn't include the North Carolina piece. So that's how I got with the Marines. When Camp Lejeune didn't come up initially, and as a lot of people who join the Navy don't think of themselves as going to the United States Marine Corps. And by the time I got to Camp Lejeune, right out of dental school, probably 10 days after I graduated, walked down the aisle at graduation, I was in my camis and in the field and learning how to dig foxholes and shoot and things that the Marines wanted their medical people to know and understand. So that got me to Camp Lejeune.
It's always interesting when I talk to people who join the JAG Corps, the medical corps, that sort of a thing in the Navy, and why they chose the Navy. And then they end up, it seems, in these situations on land, as far in the middle of Afghanistan or wherever it is, and so far removed from the water or anything they thought they would be doing in the Navy on a ship when they initially enlist or go through OCS or whatever that path may be. But it's always interesting. It's almost like the reluctant hero story, where they're signing up for one thing, and all of a sudden circumstances put them in an insane position that they never thought they would be in. And it seems like a similar story here.
Oh yeah, pretty much. But it was a great opportunity for my family and I, and obviously it led to a 30-year career. So I spent 14 years with the United States Marine Corps, and 10 of those were Fleet Marine Forces. So I was embedded in the United States Marine Corps. I served on just about every base or oversaw some medical corporate nature with the United States Marines. So I have a very strong allegiance to who they are and what they provide for our country, really.
How much do you know about what was going on in Lebanon before you shipped out?
So in about January of 1983, we picked straws, and the straws were who's going to probably go on the next deployment. And I didn't pick the shortest straw, but when the guy who picked the shortest straw looked at me and said, "Would you like to go?" I said, "Let me talk to my wife." And we decided that, I'm going to have to do a deployment at some point. It could have been up into the northern region of Norway, or it could have been a med float. And I said, "Why don't we go now? And we're going to start a family." So by February of '83, I'd been reassigned to the 1-8 battalion as their dental officer. And so in that time frame before May of '83, when we embarked, I became part of their unit in a sense, and was seeing all those patients and getting them ready for the med float that we were going to go on. And obviously, by the first group had come back in about January or February, I think. And I talked to the dental officer who had gone on that, Dan Scruggs, and he had told me, he says, "Wow, we saw where they did the terrible massacre of the PLO and all those issues there. They'd been in the country." And I'm thinking, well, this is going to be an interesting issue if we're still there, but we probably won't be there. And of course, my mindset was we're going to go on a med float and do what people on the med floats do, which is go to different ports. And I was looking forward to it. And then April came along, and of course, the bombing at the embassy occurred. And it was pretty much at that point that I realized that we might be there for a while. And then that's when I started to get interested in the politics, doing some reading. I bought a Quran. That was probably the first time I'd even thought about understanding what the cultural implications were. And from there, we debarked on the 10th or 11th of May on our journey. And, that's the beginning of the story, really.
At what point did you meet John Hudson?
John was the physician for the battalion landing team. The exact time I met him, I think we probably had some interactions early on, but my most vivid memory of John is the day we embarked on the ship up at Moore's Head. And basically, I had spent 4 weeks getting prepared. I literally had thought through every single thing I needed, and I had everything together, OCD kind of a guy. And here comes Hudson. He comes on the ship, and he's got just one sack full of stuff, not organized. And I said, "John, what are you doing?" He says, "Hell, I just started packing last night." I'm thinking, "We're going on a 6-month tour here. What are you doing?" He says, "Hell, I got too many other damn things to do. I can't be worried about this." And we were roommates on the ship over, along with the no-glow officer who passed away in the bombing, and the intelligence officer who also passed away. So the four of us were, as you know, on a Navy ship, and the lieutenants we had 4 to a room. And Hudson was bitching and moaning in his own way. He's, if you ever heard him talk, what you have, I'm sure you've listened to his audio that he sent out. He was just bitching and moaning about the whole thing. What the hell are we, And so from the very moment that our first night sleeping together, I realized he was a cranky guy, but he always said things the way he saw them. And so it was refreshing to have him around. He would take all the heat. So I would, and we were buddies, obviously. We spent a whole lot of time together, but he got away with it because the battalion commander, and especially the battalion XO at the time, they liked him as a person. He was the Hawkeye of the group, and he was a one of a kind of a guy, a Georgia boy, really.
Yeah, you guys have to away with a lot in the military, just because you rely on them for so much. Doctors, dentists, vets, JAGs to a lesser extent, but for some reason, doctors get away with quite a bit when it comes to military regulations and protocol and all these other things, because that's not really what you're concerned about. You're concerned about having the best medical professionals that you possibly can. So it's I've always liked that about him.
He loved the troops, and the troops liked him because he was a good old boy, and he would put things in their perspective. And I can remember when we were going across the ocean, I was seeing patients in the dental department on the ship, and then John said, "I'm going to give a lecture. I don't know if it was about VD or if it was about foot care or wound care." And we're out on the forecastle, and he's out there in all his glory. He's got all his corpsmen, and he's giving a lecture, and he might point over to me and say, yeah, the dentist over there, you can include my conversation about what it might involve dental issues, but he was always very good about that. So he was he was a man of the troops, really.
Yeah. And you guys had a lot in common. You're both Georgia boys. You guys had gone to the same med school. I mean, you guys are similar in age, both married. I mean, yeah, you guys
had a year ahead of me in the medical program, so I didn't know him from there. But basically, as we started to live with each other for that crossing of the Atlantic and the Med, we got to know each other pretty well. And I remember his he had a tuba with him on the when we were going over. And his favorite album, which he would listen to, was Stevie Wonder, and something I can see the album cover, and he'd be listening to that all the time. And then, of course, one of the pictures I have of him is they were going to do a boxer or a smoker on the deck of the USS Austin, and which is a boxing on the ship. And in the bright sunshine, we're going across the Atlantic, and guys are out there with their earmuffs on for boxing. And basically, he came out with his tuba and a mop on his head and was just making fun of the whole thing. But he was pissed that they were doing it because he knew that somebody could get injured, and that was going to be a problem for him or for me because of the dental issues. But he really just had a very big time with it, the whole thing. It was very comical. Of course, he was outside of the bounds of what maybe the hierarchy of the Marines thought he should do, but he was breaking the rules anyway. And of course, the guys on the ship, they were like, well, who is this guy? He was a little bit overweight, and he didn't put up with any of their guff, even though he was only a lieutenant. It was very interesting. So, yeah, God bless John.
And when you guys got there, what are some of the things that stand out to you initially during your first few days, first few weeks around?
So, bring Gil into the conversation. He had transported on the he did not go on the deck, the Iwo Jima. He went on one of the other ships, and basically, so we were separated for a period of time, and he was in charge of the wing for dental care because they came out of Cherry Point. So Gil and I hadn't spent a lot of time together. We had done a meeting or two, maybe three, but we were kind of disconnected. But when we got ashore and then we walked into our hooch, I probably got there. Well, one of us got there first, and we divided up and said, how are we going to do this? And we put our equipment together, and then we bonded, within the first day, and said, now. And so Gil's background, he had already been to Vietnam and done some things, and he's just scratching his head. How did I get here? His comments were, how did I get here? I went to dental school. I wasn't expecting this. I didn't think I'd deploy again. And myself being, well, I'm still in the critical thinking mode of not really sure what this all means, but I'm going to make it an adventure. So I was kind of the maybe a little bit naive to understand what the consequences might be, but in an optimistic way about how things would go. In that first month we were there, our travels, so Gil and I were seeing patients, and we had a full schedule and trying to interact. And then we have meetings on occasion with whoever needed to provide information from the medical standpoint. But by that time, we were separated from Hudson and his group. And so we realized that we needed our own medical coordination. And so we began to interact between John, who had his group, and then what we had at the MSSG, which you're familiar with. But that first month we were there, John and I and Gil, we took a trip down to the American University, Beirut. And I remember our ruse was we were going to go down and get distilled water for our dental equipment. And so the Rutledge, he was okay with that. He says, okay, y'all can go down. You can take a half day off, go down there. We would drive down there, and then we'd get a meal, which we weren't supposed to do because of different medical issues, but we get we were kind of sneaking out, and we were with John, and sure John was eating like a horse. And so, but we said, well, we just won't say anything because they didn't want anybody to get sick, which we did not get sick. But interestingly enough, Breeden, who was the preventive medicine personnel, he wasn't a medical officer, but he was a MSC officer. he ended up going out in town and getting sick as well. So after that, we said, well, maybe we shouldn't be eating off the economy. So we kind of learned about that. But between June and July, things were seemingly, in fact, in early July, which was the Ramadan timeframe, we were allowed to go down and stay at the Holiday Inn overnight during Ramadan. So Gil and I, we had a room. They took us down, and a couple of the senior enlisted went down, and we went down in a 6-by. And I can remember at nighttime going down the corniche with all these people outside, there fireworks. It was entertaining, and really we weren't aware of how the culture really might have felt about the Americans there, at least a sub part of the culture. And Gil and I went out on the town. We were walking around downtown. We found a bar and went in there. But the interesting thing was when we walked in, all the people walked out. And then Gil and I walked out, and he said, "Did you notice that?" I said, "Yeah, I did. They all left." I said, "Well, I'm not sure what that's all about." On the 22nd of July, I happen to remember this, was the first time that we had shelling. It was the middle of the day. It's probably about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. So it was my first time to be what I considered under fire. And I was with John Hudson in the BLT, and I was taking dental records over. I was trying to get some of the patients from the BLT to come over, talking to John. And here comes a mortar round. And then here comes another mortar round. They weren't at the BLT, but they were in our vicinity. So it was obvious the ground shook, and we kind of looked at each other and holy shit, you know. And so he took his guys, they all went down into their basement. It was one of those decisions in my head when I look back on it. I think, what the hell was I thinking? I immediately charged out of the BLT building, ran through another building between my building and the BLT. Kind of felt like I was bobbing and weaving to get back to my duty station, which was the medical department at the building. And there weren't many shells. If there were 4, maybe 5, I don't know, maybe somewhere in that area. But it was enough to put the fear of God in you to know that we were in a different situation. And of course, when I got back to my building, which was probably 3 minutes later, you know, people are trying to figure out what's going on. We began to learn the communications and the comms of what would happen under fire, and get the people who were there, including me, kind of thinking about what could happen. And I can't remember if it was before the 22nd of July or after the 22nd of July. John and I, Gil had come back to the States for about 3 or 4 weeks with family issues. And John and I, we talked about, well, what would we do with casualties? And Hudson was thinking, you know, I can handle 5 casualties. And after that, y'all going to have to handle them over there. I said, is that right? And I said, well, why don't we do a triage exercise? And we went to the powers to be and says, we're going to run a triage exercise out in the logistics area, not at the BLT and not at my building, because we realized that if people were injured, we were going to need to be able to fly them out. And we thought at the time we'd be flying them out of from the airstrip. So the corpsmen got together, we got together, John and I both had some ideas about, you know, how we might do this. But it was, once again, it was learning the process for future casualties. And it paid off huge dividends because it put each one of us in our lane and what our responsibilities were. Of course, John was the physician. He kind of had an oversight of what should happen, and he got to make the calls in a sense. But that term, I'll take the first 5 and you take the next 5, you know, Jim, at the time. I'm thinking, okay, we'll be prepared. We'll be ready. My guys will be ready, you know. And then over in August, things kind of cooled down a little bit. I think you know the scenario. And once again, we were still in a mode where there were things happening, but they weren't as, there was a slow boil in a sense. And I remember I had the opportunity to go on one of the ships to Italy for R&R. And that was somewhere in the middle of August or early August. And basically when we were coming back on the ship, the word came out on the ship that, hey, we're under fire again. And so we're pulling up into the port on the beach. And we're all hunkered down again, all the Marines who need to get to their unit, because we've heard that they've been additional shelling and additional shootings. So once again, we the slow boil was taking effect, and we were preparing ourselves mentally. I think mentally is a very big thing that I learned about being prepared to be in a situation. Unlike people who are dropped right into a really bad situation and they don't have an experience of what's going on, and that is what I really saw on the 23rd with people coming from the ships, because they were not acclimated to what was going on. Where the slow boil got us to the point where we were expecting bad things, nothing like the 23rd of October. Sadly.
Jimmy, I'm going to jump in real quick and just say, for listeners who are Gil is Dr. Gilbert Bigelow, and he is the other dentist. The two of you guys are the dentists, and of course, Dr. John Hudson runs he's the surgeon on the beach. So it's really the three of you guys are sort of the top of the medical team that's there on the beach at that point. And kind of rewinding just a little bit. I mean, you guys did get a little bit of foreshadowing of the potential of this, because y'all all went together, the three of you, and visited the American embassy, which had been blown up in April. In fact, Dr. Hudson wrote a letter to his wife right afterwards. He sent some slides of you guys actually standing outside of that embassy. And he wrote to his wife, Lisa, he said, quote, "It is unbelievable how much destruction occurred in that building." And so you guys, and you kind of saw the foreshadowing of that. Tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Well, basically, I think that occurred on one of our trips. In fact, I'm pretty sure it did occur on one of our trips to American University Beirut, and it was a flyby. It was a wake up call. It was that visual that, like I mentioned earlier with the Scarlett O'Hare and that the little clip. You look at it and you go, "Holy cow!" And the fact of the matter was, the dentist who we relieved back in late May. We talked to them quite a bit about that issue, because we were turning over in our dental medical area, and they were telling us, because they were involved a little bit with the medical response of that day in April, and so it was one of those things where you say, well, okay, it happened there, but probably not here, because we seem to have good border security around the airport where our areas are, which not quite as good as we would have hoped, I suppose, but we kind of felt insulated, probably more from the standpoint of not understanding really what is required to really protect a unit like that in an open area of a urban area, I should say.
Yeah, and for listeners too, I'll point out, of course, the American embassy was hit in April. 63 people were killed, including 17 Americans. The embassy, as Jimmy just noted, was really out there. I mean, it was just right in downtown with very light security. And the Marines are, of course, and you guys in the Navy are out there at the air base. You do have greater security and things like that. Of course, the terrorists eventually are going to figure out their way through, but you are kind of in a more separate compound than what the embassy had. Early on, you guys, and I love your description of it being sort of a slow boil, because I think that's exactly what it was. Early on, you guys are actually doing you're going out to a local orphanage, you're doing some dental care out there. I mean, there was a lot of effort to try to, hearts and minds, try to help the local community. Tell us a little bit about those experiences as well.
We went up into an area of the Shuf Mountains, and the powers to be agreed to go up there, maybe just as a community service, and did a little bit of dental work, not a lot, but we spent the day at the orphanage, and there was I got a very nice letter from the minister who was up there, and he was an American who was doing humanity work, I suppose you would say, up there with the orphanage. So. We were in a sightseeing mode, really. I mean, we wanted to see as much as we can see. That's why we had gone downtown and gone to the AUB and gone up in the Shuf. So it was a little bit relaxed. And once again, the subgroup of people who were upset with the Americans being there and didn't see us as neutral. I do remember we were considered peacekeepers, and we were considered neutral, and we were not. With the Israelis, we certainly were not joined with them. We there was a sense of staying away from their political issues, and there was a definitely juxtaposed between where they were and where we were, and there was no interaction. You also had the Italians there that and the Brits, and so we would see those individuals and tell a story about Gil. I think he did a jump with the Italians and some of the Marines because he had done some parachuting before. So things were, we were all working together as a peacekeeping group to try to settle down the problems that were occurring in Lebanon. And that's the way we all saw it. I think from the guy on the deck plate, Marine there to the people in charge, we had a responsibility to kind of cool the issues that were there and find a solution diplomatically. But so that's kind of the way it was up until September when things did change.
You guys did one of the things that turned out to be one of the most important things for the Marines there, in that you, through your practice of dentistry, started doing dental records on everybody. Because you've got all this time, you've got all these Marines, these guys are coming through. You guys started. Tell us about those efforts, and then we'll get on the backside why that turned out to be so important on the backside of this interview.
So whenever you're with a unit like that, as a dental officer, and the training that we got, the training that we received early before I ever was deployed with the Marines, you knew that the dental records were going to be a very important piece of identification. So my thought was, if a chopper goes down, there's 8 to 10 people in the chopper, we're going to want to be able to identify which remains belong to who, so that the families could resolve those issues and feel confident. Now, I wouldn't say that we were going to be the ones identifying them, but we did know that the dental records were going to be so critical. And it wasn't the records, it was the x-rays in the records. So anytime my unit, the 1-8 Marines, I had already had all their records. And basically that was what I did 3 months before, was making sure everybody was up to speed, didn't have any dental problems, and also had verification of their records. And anybody who came from, say, the United States, who was transferred into the unit, because we had people coming and going all the time, quite frankly, one of the first things I wanted to do was to get their records. They'd be carrying their records with them, and when they got to us, then I put them on my spreadsheet, and I was, once again, OCD about making sure that I had a record and an x-ray for every person who was on the ground there, every single one of them who was in the units, were coming or going. And then when they left, they would get their records. But one of the things we decided after the bombing, the shelling started, was we're going to put these records in the BLT because that's the safest place, their basement. So, and plus the Marines who were with the 1-8 who were in that building, they could go downstairs to the corpsman in the BLT building, get their dental record, and then bring it over to us. So when we did work or whatever we needed to do for them, which they required a lot of work, and there were emergency dental services as well needed to be done. So but I kept a tally of every single individual and every single unit who had been on the ground or who had left. It was my obsession with doing it the right way and being 99% as accurate as I could. So I always had confidence that I would have that piece of it. So yeah, and it became important later, as you mentioned.
I wanted to ask you about where you would go and watch the fighting in the mountains. When was the first time that you did that? What that experience was like, and then the recordings that you made of that artillery out in the distance.
So we had a basement in our building as well. Our building was a 1-story structure. The windows were all blown out. We had sandbags in the windows to some extent, but they were open, so you'd have a breeze in the building because it was hot. And we had, when shelling occurred, which occurred a lot in September, we would go down into the basement and get the medical people together. And if we had issues where people had to go out and pick people up, I think, before the 23rd of October, we had 6 KIAs and 58 individuals who were wounded. So we had a lot of training opportunities. At the time, you wouldn't consider it training, but it was training to us on who the people were that were going to go, take a vehicle to go pick up the individuals, what medical persons were going to be there, the comms and those types of things. But I can remember in some occasions, depending on what the shelling was or what the gunfire was, we would be in the basement and you'd be fully dressed. And then what you were hoping, and all the lights would be out in the building except for the red lights, which would allow us to kind of move around. The infrared red lights that you'd have on your flashlight or we had in the building. But it became a point where after 3 or 4 hours in the basement, you go, you go stir crazy down there. There were 25, 30 people in the basement. So you come up, and if there wasn't shelling, you would. I think it was probably Colonel Garrity from a different building that would give the okay to go ahead and be able to go back up to your living spaces. But like people do, we would wander around, and that was all from my building or my room. I did make some tapes of that. And the funny thing was, what you say on those tapes, and how you're analyzing things, you're just getting very acclimated to it. And if it doesn't hit you right next to your head, right in the room, you figure it's not that close, but it's very close. You can hear the bullets, and you can see the tracer rounds. The thing about that also is that they seem to have set times and patterns. Although the first bombing on the first shelling on the 22nd of July was in the middle of the day, later on, the fighting in the mountains was always almost after dark, and it would go until about 1 o'clock. It was almost like they had a routine going. But when you watch those tracer rounds, 1 in 5 is a tracer round. You just multiply that by 5, know how much ammunition is being fired between the Shuf Mountains. Now that was between the Druze and the Lebanese, and I'm assuming the Syrians. So there was a lot of different factions there. And you might also remember that the Lebanese army was very close to where we were, and they were all young people. And we'd see them. They were in close proximity to where my building was, and they would be shelled. You could tell that they were trying to hit them, and sometimes they'd have, I don't know if there was direct shelling in September on us, but we had a direct hit on our compound. It was right at dusk. It was about 7 o'clock, right at dusk, and I was just getting ready to mail a letter to my wife. And when that shell hit our building, everybody who was within 50 yards or 60 yards of it, we were all deaf. I can remember the ringing in my ears. And that was another thing that you don't think about until you've been in gunfire, and you realize that a lot of different things change. We had 4 injuries that day where we had to once again get the comms up, get them stabilized, figure out where the helicopter could land, and get them medical evacuated out of there. And John had his own set of issues where he was. So once again, we were working independently to try to take care of the most people without moving people around the base, because it was unsafe to move from one building to the other at nighttime when the shelling and rifle fire occurred.
Yeah, for listeners, so just to kind of give a little bit of a 30,000 foot view here. So, you guys are really kind of caught in the middle of this civil war. And because what's happening in Lebanon at this point is you've got a national central government, which is run by Christians, but it really only controls Beirut and some suburbs and areas around it. And then meanwhile, you've got all these other different sectarian factions that are sort of fighting for power, the Druze, the Sunnis, the Shias, and whatnot. And so the Americans and the Brits and the Italians are all sort of on the sidelines of this. And you guys are very precariously placed kind of in the middle of it, because you've got the mountains all around you, your backs are up against the sea, and you're right here. And as you noted, you've got the Lebanese military camped out right next door. And so early on, I think, folks Jack and I talked to, yourself included, talked about, you're kind of on the sidelines of somebody else's fight. You could see it going on in the mountains up around the tracers. I mean, one guy we talked to said it was like being on the sidelines of the Super Bowl. Guys would eat hot dogs and watch the fire at night. But that begins to change as the summer passes. And you guys are, what starts off as sort of indiscriminate stray rounds and things like that becomes more and more intense and more targeted towards you guys. So sort of tell us about that change as the summer of '83 kind of goes over. You touched on it a little bit, but kind of digging a little more on that.
I will say one thing. Gil and I were always, we had a little store on the compound, and we would get them to bring us the English version or the English language version of the weekly magazine for Lebanon, and it was probably Christian sided, but we would read that from cover to cover. I mean, it was like the New York Times. We were going to find out what their thinking was. It was for the people of Lebanon. So we were very engaged with all the issues. And of course, every night at dinner we would be talking about what are the possibilities and what's going on, or could we be leaving because things are getting heated, or what were the threats? And of course, the intelligence officer, who had been my roommate coming over, he would dribble out information that we go, oh gosh, that doesn't sound very good, but we're not going to talk about it too much to get everybody too concerned. So we knew that things were heating up. By the end of August and early September, the shelling and the possibility of shelling increased, and so that's when these large numbers of casualties occurred. And of course, we had some of the shelling was during the day and killed Stauffer, which was a couple of days actually before the 23rd of October. But so yeah, things were definitely heating up. We were on the sidelines, and we would watch, all the battles that were occurring in the mountains. And of course, the mountains were just draped right up, so you could see, between the peaks of the mountains, which groups were which, and so yeah, it was. We were becoming aware that things were not good, and there were many times that we kind of got the word that we might be leaving. Of course, that's secondhand knowledge for a guy where I was, but I think Colonel Garrity was trying to work the issues. And of course, McFarland, he would come back and forth to our base, and we knew who he was because he was the one that was being quoted in the newspapers that we were reading all the time. So all that was very intriguing and interesting for myself and for Gil. We were kind of playing the backseat thinking process of it, where some people probably wouldn't be quite as much, but we were.
What do you remember about John Hudson over that summer and into the fall? About any premonitions?
Yeah. So John was the story that I relate to people was that he was from Middle Georgia, and his wife was from Milledgeville, and Sam Nunn was the senator at the time, and he was like, damn it, his perception of what was going on, and our perception in a sense, and what we were hearing from, say, the American news networks was very, very different than we were listening also to the BBC on a daily basis, especially Gil and I, but the BBC seemed to have an understanding of what was going on in the area. And John, he was very concerned because he realized that we were under a huge amount of potential danger, as we all did. But he was going to write the letter to our senator. And he came up to me and says, will you sign this letter? And I said, well, no, probably not going to sign the letter, John, but I'm writing Sam Nunn, and he's going to know about this, which he did, in which I don't know if he ever got a response. I'm sure Lisa Hudson could tell you. But he, as an American citizen, he felt the right that he could talk to a senator to say, what we're seeing on the American news networks and what we think what's happening to us in reality seem to be two different shows, two different realities. And of course, I experienced the same kind of a thing because I guess, well, I won't speculate about the news, how they were scoping that. It was just one of those things where they were trying to keep it, they were trying to be successful at the peacekeeping mission, but things were unraveling around us to some degree.
We've got, John, one thing he did such a wonderful job was write letters. And, we were very fortunate to get 640 pages of John's personal letters.
Holy cow.
Thanks to Lisa. And John frequently wrote about his, initially he was excited to be in the Middle East, just like so many of you were. And then as the situation turned, he, like you, were really on the front lines because when somebody's getting injured, it falls to him and to you guys to have to take care of. And he would write letters about pulling shrapnel out of people that was still hot to touch and having to pronounce people dead. And so his frustration really mounted, and it came out. He did write that letter to Sam Nunn. I'll tell you a little anecdote on that. We tracked down Sam Nunn's papers at the University of Georgia. I think they may have been at Emory. And of course, dealing with the archivist there, they had a log of showing that John Hudson's letter coming in on this date and everything. And so we were super excited. We were going to get to see what John wrote because you'd mentioned it to us. Lisa had mentioned it to us. They destroyed it. It was It was accidentally filed as a constituent request, and all of the letters that went to Sam Nunn's office for constituent request were destroyed, whereas papers dealing with positions in that they wanted him to take were preserved. And so because it was sent as a constituent request. So unfortunately, his letter was lost to history, but he very much did follow through on that and write his concerns on that. In fact, Sam Nunn, we reached out because a lot of his stuff was still classified, so to speak, constituent things like that. And Sam Nunn's office actually asked for them to search for this letter for us. And so we owe a thanks to Sam Nunn, to him and his staff for checking on that. But unfortunately, that letter was lost. But Jimmy, as you said, he made that effort. And John didn't, it struck me, John was not going to be a career naval officer. He had joined the Navy. He was, was looking for help paying off his med bills. He was married. He had an infant child. He was here to do it as he headed back to Milledgeville to become a country doctor. So he didn't care if he ruffled feathers. But he was very clear in kind of what he saw for things there.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about the day before on the bombing on the 22nd. What do you remember about the day before the bombing?
Well, it was a Saturday. So within the last 4 or 5 days before that, things had calmed down. We hadn't had any shelling. We hadn't had any gunfire. There'd been some talk about us leaving. So, a couple of days of no activity, you get used to doing your routine again. We're walking over to the BLT to get food, to get a breakfast and a dinner. And, we're just going back to normal business because that's what you do in a zone where you can't be afraid of everything all the time. You have to just have a routine regardless of what the dangers are. As anybody who's been in combat understands that you wear yourself out if you worry about things too much. And that Saturday, there was a country western band there. And I remember meeting the Jewish chaplain who came over, and we were out watching I walked over. It was they were playing music. I wasn't real interested in watching it, so I hung around for a little while. The troops were enjoying it quite a lot. I probably had something else to do, but I definitely walked over, looked at the stage, listened to a song or two, and people were relaxing, which is what you want to do on a Saturday afternoon. When you're deployed. During that time, I had a sense. I went up to the top of the BLT building and I took some pictures off from that standpoint. Kind of watching what the guards were doing. Not that I wouldn't have anything to say about that, but there were sentries up on the top of that building, and I'd walk up there. And of course, I'm a lieutenant, so I'm an officer. So they would acknowledge me, and they knew I was a dentist, and they'd seen me every day coming into chow. And, we'd be looking, and I'd be talking to them about, well, what are you looking for? And they'd be talking about, which areas they were kind of overseeing and what kind of problems they'd seen on that. And I took pictures all the way around that building, just exactly what it looked like. Because from the top of the building looking west, I could see the Mediterranean. From looking south, I could see the tower, the tower. Looking east, I could see the Shuf Mountains and then the airfield strips. And looking north, you could barely see not the city, but you could see the urban sprawl that was going away from the airport. So, and of course, probably taken a week before the building went down. So, I look at those pictures and think to myself, that we were, I was up there. They had guys on the roof for sure that were, trying to do their job well, and that was their position. But that Saturday, I probably had 2 Heinekens because that was the limit you're supposed to have in the little senior enlisted officer gathering place in my building. And, probably went to bed, maybe wrote a letter, maybe played chess with Gil, maybe listened to the BBC. And of course we went to bed as we would every other night, prepared to get out of Iraq. There were some nights that I probably slept with my shoes on and ready to ready to activate, but we'd wound down a little bit. Of course, the next morning was another story, but that's kind of the feeling that we had. We were living until the November 14th or 13th or whenever we were going to be shipping out, hoping that other group would come if they were going to relieve us. So,
yeah. And then, what are your memories of that morning on the 23rd?
Well, so where my building was about, I'll say 200 yards away, 150 yards away. There was an intermediate small building between us and the BLT with trees. So I couldn't really see the BLT from where our building was. And of course, at 6:21 or, when the explosion went off, we were all still sleeping. I was in my bed. And the explosion had a reverberation all the way to our building, which knocked sandbags, out of those windows and knocked the door off the hinges. And I told Jim the story. It's a silly piece of my memory, but when the door got knocked off of my hooch, and I jump up out of bed, holy cow, what was that? And Gil's, right next to me. I don't know, it was louder than anything we'd heard at all. Okay, well, here we go again. Let's get our guys together and get downstairs. I said, look at the door, it's knocked off. I picked up my camera to take a picture of it to record, something silly. And we go out in the hallway, and now you're looking 45 seconds to a minute later. You're thinking to yourself, okay, is anybody hurt in our building? I looked at Gil and go, you got to turn your helmet around, because he had it on the wrong, because we were, obviously scooping up all our stuff, our medical stuff, our flak jackets. And so we immediately went down into the basement because is everybody okay? Is everybody okay? The first patient we had was actually our senior chief medical guy, Chief Vaughn at the time. And he had a rock fall on his head, probably gave him a concussion. And he was very soon, in the next minutes, he was experiencing what a concussion would do, which would cause you to have nausea feeling. And so Chief Vaughn was injured. I mean, he was right there. He took a blow to the head. And so we all went downstairs, and within just a couple of minutes, maybe 2, maybe 3, Major Rutledge came down and he looked at the guy, said, Gil, come on with me. We're gonna go over to the BLT because we think that they've been hit. There was no other shells at that point. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that's fine. I don't want to go anyway. So I'll sit right here with my guys. And so the activities that I would do, I would go, okay, we have comms with John. This now I'm thinking, where are my drivers at? Who's going to be the guys these are Marines now? Who's going to go pick up wounded people? Where are my corpsmen at? Who's going to go with them? You're going to go in the first Jeep. You're going to go in the second Jeep if there's issues. Do we know where the bombing was? Did it hit the airfield? Were there helicopters involved? Did it hit the ammo dump? Did it hit we didn't know. And what are the communications with the BLT? And there's no communication. We can't get them up. The communications are down. Okay, well, you know what? I'm hungry. Let me get something to eat, because we don't know yet. And then within about 3, 4, 5 minutes, for a very short period of time, Gil comes running back down the stairs. He goes, Jim, BLT's been hit. Prepare for mass casualties. Okay, we'll do that. Okay, guys, get your stuff together. Let's go up and see what's going on. The Jeeps went out, and for a period of time, maybe 10 minutes, we didn't see smoke. We couldn't see the visual of the BLT going. And then people started showing up at our door. Maybe it was 8 minutes, maybe it was 10 minutes, who were walking wounded. And I tell the story, and I think James has it in the book, where one of the lance corporals or corporals walked into the building and totally covered with silt and totally deaf, and talking about how he had spun out of the building and landed on his feet and had gotten over to this area, and he had injuries, but he was deaf and he was covered with silt, and somewhat speaking incoherently, but understandably after knowing what reality was. And then another one comes, and that was Aurora, and he had facial trauma. So now you got 2 people, then you got a third person, then you got a fourth person, You got a fifth person. Okay, well, corpsmen are doing their thing. They're taking care, what they need to do. I'm looking at Aurora. I can remember, because I'm a dentist, I went right for his jaw, and his jaw was fractured. But these were walking wounded. And when you have walking wounded, they're not the worst. But you don't know that at the time. You just begin to disperse out the people who can help the individuals. And after about the fifth or sixth guy, we're like, the cellar's full. We're going to need to move upstairs. We're going to have to get some stretchers and put them out. And so by that time, the walking wounded had decompensated to some degree. And so we had problems getting them up the stairs. The stairs were very narrow. And that was my first clue that we can't be bringing people down the stairs because we won't be able to get them up and down. It's a very narrow corridor. So all the patients have to go on the first deck where our rooms were in our open air areas, because that's where they needed to go. And then within another 4 or 5 minutes, here comes the first 6x truck with people in the back of it who have been placed in there. Now, these are individuals who some are conscious, some are unconscious. That's when it hit me that we have a lot of people injured. And I'm
Jimmy,
thinking,
you don't know at this point how big this casualty is. I mean, you haven't seen the building. Gil doesn't told you the BLT's gone. He just says it's been hit. So you don't really know the scope yet of what you're dealing with.
I'm dealing with each individual situation moment by moment. And, I'm still thinking that John's got 5 or 6 patients he's treating. And now I've got 5 or 6 patients out of the 6x that I'm treating that are conscious or unconscious, or that the corpsmen are treating as well. And so I'm still thinking Dr. Hudson's doing his thing and I'm doing my thing. Now we're executing the plan that we had talked about months before about, divvying up the casualties. So now our concern is where are the helicopters? Where the helicopters going to be coming? And so the communications were down. And so now my anxiety is like, well, we got some people here really seriously wounded. We don't have enough hands to try to, to try to help them. So that went on for, a good half hour, 45 minutes before we had any idea that there was going to be people coming from the ships, which probably took about 45 minutes in my estimation, before we saw the first somebody come and go, hey, there's a helicopter over on the other side of the airfield, which is not an area that we had practiced or contemplated taking patients to. And so, okay, well, it's a possibility that we could begin to load people up. And then within an hour, we started having some junior or individuals from the ship who arrived to kind of begin to help. But really, most of those individuals went to the building. And during that time, during that first 45 minutes to an hour to hour and a half, time is it's hard to remember exactly. But we accumulated probably close to 90 people, maybe quite a lot of people, some that were injured, that were conscious, some that were unconscious, some that were walking wounded. And basically over that next 2 hours, 2.5 hours, we began to ship people to where the helicopters were. And my biggest fear during the thinking of what was going on was how fast could we move these individuals? And the helicopter squadrons did an amazing job with beginning to move people. But, during those first couple of hours, things were moving very quickly. And one of the things
I was going to say, what is your goal as a medical rescuer here? What is your goal? Because you're not operating on people. Your goal is, tell us, like, how is this? Your goal is to get them stabilized. What are you doing? Get them out of there. Walk us through the whole process of that.
So once we got upstairs and I took a look around and realized that there were different categories of individuals who were showing up on the 6x. There were people who were already died, who were already dead. And those individuals needed to be placed in an area that was not evident to the other individuals. Because you had patients coming in, you had individuals who had been blown up, and yet they were coming back to where we were. They'd been thrown on a 6x at the building. So that was the expectant category or the deceased category. Then I saw a situation where we had unconscious individuals who had a pulse, had a heartbeat, were breathing, but needed stabilization. And that was the critical wounded individuals. And in a triage situation, you have walking wounded. They're kind of, they're the easiest ones to push to the side or to make those individuals help you, because we didn't have a whole lot of people in the building. Many of the people in the building went to the BLT to begin to dig people out. So we had the expectant, we had critically wounded, we had another critically wounded because the numbers continued to add up. Had another, between critically wounded and walking wounded was like a fourth group. And then we had the walking wounded who actually could help the other individuals, whether it was holding their hand or holding a pressure bandage on someone. They were deaf, right? The walking wounded were deaf, but they could see they needed to do things. And then for the individuals who were really traumatized or acting out emotionally, those individuals needed to be helped somewhere else so they didn't disturb the things that were going on, which, is understandable. But that's also a group of individuals who had, they were in disbelief about what had happened and couldn't quite wrap themselves around that. So, you had a lot of different groups, but the critical wounded people that I was looking at, and I'm looking at the worst of the worst who their lives could be saved. And then I am picking the individuals who are going to get and go to be airlifted. And, we had 65 people in that category, but the number of people that you can say this one, this one, this one, this one, that's kind of where I was. I was trying to identify the most critical wounded who could get on a 6x. And this is, all happens over a 90-minute to 2-hour evolution, not knowing where I knew where the beginning was, but not knowing what the end would be. And I'm still thinking about John Hudson. He must be seeing a lot of people, because if he sent this many people to me, that's the scene that I had in front of me. And during that time, so it had been discussed that there was a truck bomb. So within the first hour or so, somebody said there was a truck bomb. Okay, a truck bomb. We're doing our stuff back and forth. And then it came out that, hey, we think there's a truck bomb that's going to hit our compound. That was in that morning. So they think there was a truck stopped outside on the southern end of our building. Now, who they are and what secondhand or thirdhand information, I didn't have that exactly, but I knew that there was a potential threat. Now I'm moving people to the back of our building. We got to move these people. I didn't see the truck. I don't, it was just one of those things that happens in the fog of war or the fog of chaos, that we were trying to at least get a partially away. Maybe if it was just 15 or 20 yards away from where our building and the road into the airport was, because there was a potential truck bomb there. That all fizzled out later, and that wasn't reality. But in my mind's eye, it was real during that time. And that was another decision point to direct people to say, this is what we have to do, because they don't know what's going on either. And they don't quite understand when somebody's giving guidance or direction, which was what I was doing, trying to communicate with the people at the site, trying to communicate with the Colonel Garrity, who was also kind of coming back and forth to kind of see what was going on. He was well aware, his executive officer was trying to understand also where the communication needed to be filled in, and how we were going to get these individuals to certain places, and what we were doing, and what we could handle. So all those things were kind of happening. Colonel Garrity, who came to the building maybe within 40 minutes of the situation to kind of assess what was going on. I remember that, and he looked at me and said, Jim, what do you need? What do you need? What do you need? Well, we need to be able to get these people out of here. Colonel, we gotta get these people to the ship, and so that interaction, we're trying to make things happen. And obviously, he was moving as fast and as quick as he could to get things going and to educate of course, he's got to educate our authority, because that's his role, is to make sure that people way out there knew what was going on, but he wanted a bird's eye view of what he was seeing. So again, that was my impression of what, he and my interaction were. And then one of my other things was, I remember later, one of the a Red Cross, must have been a Red Cross. I'll say he was a doctor, but he may not have been. But he brought a whole thing of morphine for us. And we had medical supplies, and we had pain medications and those types of things. But I thought it was a very honest and gesture that he handed me this big bag of Surrett morphine. And the problem was I didn't know what to do with it, because we weren't handing out morphine to every patient, and if we did, we had to tag them on the top of the head, because morphine in itself can be, something that can take you down. But a lot, these, especially the critically wounded individuals, they needed pain control. So, that was happening as well with documentation to the best we could. It wasn't always perfect documentation, but I think it was helpful. But the Surretts that he gave us, I stressed on for 2.5 months until we got back to America on what I was going to do with them, because they were, they're morphine, and you don't want them to get out of the way, and we had no written trail of them. So just something I remember. Sorry.
What was the range of injuries that you're seeing throughout these hours?
Well, it was from people who had been crushed and killed and completely discombobulated, to people who had fractures, severed limbs, those types of things. People who, a lot of the injuries, the individuals didn't show injuries like you would think of from bullet wounds or from shrapnel. They were compression injuries, and I think a lot of them also from percussion of the explosion. In fact, one of the things when we read the follow-up and autopsies and the other things that happened on the ship and then further on, is a lot of these people weren't bleeding. The people who died, I mean, they weren't, their blood had coagulated. And I often wondered, and I talked to pathologists about this, was that something to do with the concussion of the blast that might have caused their blood to coagulate? And I don't have the answer to that, but it was a very unusual thing that people who had severe injuries didn't bleed as you might think they would. But many of the unconscious individuals who had been put on to those the 6-bys and came to us, who were unconscious or semi-conscious or moaning, there were no obvious injuries. So the treatment for them was to make sure they had an open airway, that somebody was following that. If we obviously ran out of certain supplies like oxygen or simple Ventura oxygen mask very quickly, but those individuals needed to make sure that they didn't close off their airway. It wasn't something that you would do immediately for them. You wouldn't give them morphine if they were not conscious, but you could tell they were still breathing. They were still active. I mean, there was quite a few of those individuals that were in that kind of state where they probably in the state of shock, as you might call it, and so those individuals were some of the first that I said, we got to get these guys to the ship, and they would be some of the first that went off, because they were obviously incapacitated, but they were still alive, and they survived, thank God. But so that's the kind of things that you would see, not only crushing injuries, but these unexplained unconscious individuals. It could be, head trauma or other things, but at the time you wouldn't exactly know, but they were not completely unconscious. They weren't like dead to the world, but their ability to have consciousness was not there. Semi-conscious might be a proper word.
Yeah, and I'll kind of just say, just for listeners, so 350 soldiers, sailors, and Marines in that building, 241 killed, 112 wounded. So it's and the majority of those wounded went right through your hands on their way out and to the ship. So you kind of saw it all. And I did read in the after reports too by some of the pathologists, literally how many of them were concussion related, head related injuries, because of course, the whole building's coming down on top of people. So it's so much of it is falling concrete, rebar. And how horrific those injuries are.
And, so, I mean, my experience was my experience. And of course, Gil, and I need to speak because Gil Bigelow went to the site, and he found himself going around the site trying to get a handle on the elephant. The elephant was so big, and the debris patterns around that building were so wide out that he was going around trying to help the wounded. He tried to help the people who couldn't be taken out of the building, who died in the building, but might have been semi-conscious, as I described, through his actions and the actions of the corpsmen who were with him that came from our building. So they each had their own individual, incredible, heroic stories that, they have. I mean, I'm just a small part of how that whole thing fessed out. But, and when Gil came back, after about 2.5 or 3 hours, we had people come from the ship who were helping, and now they're digging people out. Now they're not acclimated to what's going on. They're trying their absolute best to help, but their mindset and our mindsets who were on the ground would be different. I mean, ours were, we got a job to do and we're going to do it. There's a certain fear factor when you come from a ship and then you come into this situation where you haven't heard a bullet fired ever, or at least not during that time. So there are different things happening. And so Gil came back to my compound after about 2.5, 3 hours to see what we were doing. And the first question I asked Gil is, how's John Hudson? He goes, we haven't found John Hudson. And he still couldn't describe to me, that I could visualize what had happened to the building. And I said, do you think he's alive? He said, I don't know, because there's so much going on. There's so many movements and moving parts going on. He didn't come through here. And no, he didn't come through here. You don't think it's like, you think he got killed, because I'm still haven't seen the building yet. And it wasn't until I went up to the building, and Gil Bigelow tell you the story about him going up there and seeing, the first no sound at all when him and Major Rutledge went to the building. When the building went down, it was completely quiet. And my first drive, which was about 3.5 or 4 hours to go see the building, was very similar, where the leaves are down. I'm looking at that building and it's not there. Of course, there's people crawling in and out to try to figure out what was going on. But by that time, people were extremely disheartened because they had found almost all of the people who were going to come out of the building. And that reality amongst the people at that building who were trying to help really set into me. I could see that in their eyes that, how could this have happened? There's nobody else here. What are we going to do? And my mind's going with, well, I guess, okay, whatever we need to finish up back at where I was pretty much done. I'd medevaced all the people that needed to be done. We had some walking wounded that we held. By that time, a physician from the ship had come and basically had allowed, and he was taking care of some of the walking wounded, trying to get his feet on the ground. That was the flight surgeon who was on the USS Iwo Jima. So things changed about that time. About 3.5 hours into it, we had people at the site digging now for any remains of individuals. Of course, that's about the time that Wheeler, Chaplain Wheeler, was finally pulled out of the building alive. You probably just got that story from the chaplain. I think I had come up to the site at about the time that he had been pulled out of that building, which was, what did he say? Did he, about 3.5 hours, maybe?
Yeah, it was actually early afternoon. It was around 1 p.m. So it was about 5 after. Yeah, and I was you mentioned, to bring Gil in on this, because we haven't interviewed Gil on camera like this. Gil, of course, your counterpart, he's there. And a couple quotes that Gil told us in the course of these research, he said, this direct quotes from Gil because he's over there at the site. But some of these guys were blown to bits. I was recovering arms and legs. Another comment he said was, some of these guys literally died in your hands. And so he was there. So, and I wanted to kind of back up for just a second. So when Gil comes and tells you, you're asking, because this whole time you're thinking, my buddy John Hudson's, he's doing all this. That's really the first time it kind of dawns on you. John may not be a rescuer. John may be a victim.
That's right. Once again, I'm thinking the building's still there. So I still haven't exactly visualized what's happening. But even at that moment of 3 hours later, I'm still hoping that my friend is alive, because I haven't seen the building. Pretty soon after that moment, I take the Jeep over to see what's going on. I mean, it's almost like giving Gil a break in a sense, but that kind of is what was going on in the early afternoon, or noontime.
Tell us, what was it like when you first got over to where the BLT had been? What describe that scene for us?
Well, I mean, obviously, the driving up to the building or going up to the building, and the first thing that I noticed was the defoliation of the trees, and then the fact that you look across a span which I'd walked to every day for months to get breakfast and dinner, and I could see all the way to the airport tower, and then of course the building slabs were obviously collapsed on each other. That was one of the things that you notice about the building. So it was completely on itself. And people, the interesting thing was, bring this to mind, was that the Lebanese soldiers who had been so close to where we were, they were still active, very active in trying to get people out. They were very, very active. And they saved a lot of lives because they didn't have a fear of what might happen. It was obvious they were trying to help us. And for the most part, they were very engaged in digging in that building. So I'm very appreciative of that aspect. The Marines, I think, were in disbelief in some regards. Of course, some of the Navy corpsmen, one in particular, Paul from the ship. I'm trying to pull up his last name.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about, Paul. It starts with a D. I can spell it, but I can't pronounce it. So, because that's actually an important story.
Yeah, it is an important story. That second class petty officer, who's a dental tech from USS Austin, gave 1,000% to take care of patients and then to try to get those dental records out of that basement. And I credit him. He did a tremendous job. But there was just a lot.
He asked you at one point, he's like, what else can I do? And you're like, well, I do have one other assignment for you.
Now that was because once we realized that we had so many, there was two things started to happen at about 1:00. And to answer your question, when I got to the building, I saw the building, saw what was going on around the building. I couldn't even walk around the building, but I'm like, okay, people are taking care of this issue. And then my next thought was, I need to go to the flight line. So I went to the flight line where we had been medevacing people, and the helicopters were now waiting for patients. I'm like, we've gotten all the patients out of here? Yeah, but we're waiting. Do you have any more? Well, no, there's no more patients. It's 3 or 4 hours later. And then I walked into a hangar, and then the hangar had the deceased members of our unit. And so that was a terrible job for the Marines who were placing these individuals in body bags. And to look out at those body bags is kind of like the thing that I sent you earlier about the Gone with the Wind scene. I mean, that's what it was. And then what were we going to do with those individuals? Because then we had planes fly in. So there's a lot of different things going on now at about 12 to 1:00. And we had people in the hospitals there who were picked up and brought to the hospitals in the Lebanon system. And there wasn't just one hospital, there was quite a few, and we didn't know who they were. So we had to have people go out and find those people in the hospitals who didn't have identification. And then we had the deceased. And then we had a plane fly in. I don't know exactly the time, but to me it seemed to be about 2:30 or 3:00 that actually flew to the airport. And then they were going to take patients from the ship back to the flight area on land and put them on the Air Force medevac plane. So all those things are happening that afternoon. It was very intense. And that's when the dental record issue came up. We have to have the dental records to identify the deceased who were going to be flown to Ramstein. And that's when Paul Diaz, he said, is there something else I can do? And I said, we got to find those dental records because they're in the basement. So now I changed my complete line of thinking. I get with Colonel Garrity or the executive officer for the MAL and say, I'll get, I got to get the dental records. Because you need to get the dental records, but we don't have any rosters. We don't know who was in the building. I said, I think I know who was in the building. I've got all these documents. I've taken care of every single person who's come into the theater. I know who they are, but I had them on long green computer paper, and I'd kept a very accurate roster over and over and over again. I killed a lot of trees over the months before that just to have a good accurate roster. So I had to go at that point for me. I mean, this is late afternoon. I'm thinking we got to get those dental records. Can we get the dental records? And that's where Paul became so important to what my mission was at that point, was to get those records and then send them to Ramstein. And 93% of the people who were identified with those dental records, which we finally got over a number of days, but the initial gauntlet of that. And so anyway, I cross-hatched the WIAs, the KIAs, the MIAs, missing in action. And there were a lot of MIAs because we didn't know who was in the unit, and we didn't know who was out on the outside perimeter, and we didn't know who had left. And although it seems like an obvious thing, well, why wouldn't you know? Well, all the records were destroyed except for the records that I had. And that's not the way that you want to do it, but it was the reality of the situation. And
Paul, we talked to Paul, and he said, he literally had to kind of like climb down through this rubble and tunnel down because they were in the basement of the BLT. And, there were pockets and things like that. So he could kind of make his way down. And of course, there were bodies down there that he encountered. Of course, there was fires underground still smoldering. There was the fear that the ammunition and ordnance that was stored down there would go off. And so he had to kind of tunnel down there and find these records and bring them out. And we also talked with Dr. Robert Sundquist, who is the dentist in Ramstein, who did a lot of the dental identification. And he talked about when they got these records, they, were opening these boxes up and there were pieces of concrete and dust in there, but also how vital these records were. And one of the interesting things he said is he had previously worked, he was a forensic dentist. He had previously worked the Guyana, the Jonestown massacre. And in that situation, they had no records. And yet here they were confronted with another mass casualty in which they had all the records. And they were able to positively identify everybody. And the majority of those were through your dental records. So it was that foresight and having those records paid off in being able to identify the remains and giving peace to all those family members. I think that's such an important story.
Yeah. We didn't have DNA at the time. And the FBI had all of our fingerprints, but the fingers didn't match up. I mean, I think they only had 53% of the fingerprint identification. So the dental records, they became, very important.
They were super important, particularly as the days went on and because bodies decompose in that hot, brutal summertime heat of Lebanon. And so the dental records were critical. So.
And I wanted to ask about when you realized that John Hudson didn't make it.
So it became obvious that there were no other people going to come out of the building. I mean, after Chaplain Wheeler, jumped out of his seat once he lifted the rock off of him, and he jumped out and ran down the hill. There was just no one else, and I had a personal want to know we had found John Hudson. So I told the people at the site, I told whoever was kind of in charge, we worked through the night that night, with big lights, and people continued to work through the night to dig through, to go through. And it may have been the next day, or it may have been 2 days. I'm not really sure, but I wanted to see John Hudson. I wanted to know that he was in the building. And so somebody came and got me and said, who do you think we found Dr. Hudson? So they had already kind of unraveled him to some degree. And I, went over there and I said, I think that's John. That guy, he looks like John. I think that might be him, but this is now a day or two. I can't, I'm not certain about the timeline, but it was not the day of the bombing. And I said, well, how did you find him? He said, well, he's that's where he was and that's where he is. And basically he had his hand on his head. And so you kind of had to move that around and go, I think that's John, sign of the cross, and a moment for me to say he's there, and walked away. Okay, let's go back to doing business. But, God rest his soul. And you may know the story, and I'll tell it to you. Weeks later, months later, really, I went and visited Lisa Hudson in Milledgeville. It's a tough one, so let me get through it. And we had a personal moment. Lisa and I had a personal moment where we were talking about John, how crazy he was, but, it was emotional, but we were both going back and forth. And I was able to tell Lisa that, say, I really wanted to, I knew John had passed and was dead, but I really wanted to see him. And when I walked up to the area where he was at and they had kind of pulled him out, I said, he died there. Because her parents, her family, who probably now passed, they thought they saw John on the television, CNN News. They thought he was doing medical stuff, and he wasn't. But, I didn't know any of this piece of it at the time. It was just, after the fact. And, I told Lisa, I said, no, he died. I saw him. He died. He was in the building. He was on his back. He was sleeping. I don't think he ever knew anything had happened. And she went and got a picture. Oh, excuse me. And I said, no, he had his hand on his head, and, he may have heard something, but I think he died immediately. And I went up and showed, I don't know if you could see it, but, his hand on his head. This is how we found him, or he was found, and this is what I saw. And she jumped up and ran out of the room. I said, okay, well, I've upset her, but I understand because I'm upset too. And she came back with a picture, and she said, that's how John slept. That's how John slept, with his hand up on his forehead. I'm like, well, that's how he was found. And she was so comforted to know that he was sleeping when he passed. I mean, he was probably killed immediately. And that's a story between Lisa and I, but it's, it meant a lot to me, and, why I needed to see him, before they bagged him up, and why, and, all that was, fortuitous, that it gave her, in her own mind, knowing that, nothing had happened to him, because you can come up with strange stories when you saw somebody on television, and she could put that to rest and let her parents know the same thing. So that's that story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a powerful moment, because, and also too, to know that, he passed immediately, that he wasn't trapped underground, and things like that. I mean, and Jack and I know Lisa. We've talked to her. We had dinner with her together. She's phenomenal. She shared John's letters with us.
How many pages did you say?
640 pages. She had 9 hours of recordings that he had made on cassette tapes and sent back. So we got to hear John's accent, and look, hey, I'm from South Carolina, so I love another good Southern accent. He was a Georgia boy, like you, and so getting to hear his recordings of him, and you could still hear the machinery in the background in Beirut at the time. I mean, it was literally just like going back in time and hearing.
I got one more thing to say, if I could. Yeah. I went back and listened to the tape that his brother, John's brother, had put on the internet, and and I only found out about it after I talked to Lisa at the 40th service that we had, and so I went back and I listened to the tape, and it was the tape where he sent off to a social worker about what was going on there. And what's interesting is this is 1983, and the social worker, there was a conversation, but the social worker was trying to her illusion was that everybody there was scared and depressed and like having problems. I won't say PTSD, but was having problems. And John, in that tape, goes, no, I haven't had any Marines come to me with a lot of issues. I'm the medical guy. They haven't come to me. they're here to do a mission. They're peacekeepers, and they want to do a mission. They do want to go home, but they understand what their mission is. And there were no, kind of sulking or whining or that type of thing. And I thought to myself, he's absolutely right. Everybody knew they had a job to do, and everybody was there to support the people around them. And when you get the military in a situation like we were in, people come together as a team, and there were no, outliers. There were no people who were, were disavowing the team. I thought an important point, because now, society's changed quite a bit. You get people, outliers, who are going to complain about what's going on. And I guess shouldn't go there, but I thought it was very important for John to have made that commentary. He wasn't finding people who were depressed as the medical doctor there, and they all had access to him. They might have been saddened, but they were there to do a mission. So anyway.
When you look back on that time there, what changed for you following that bombing? What lessons did you take from it that you passed on to others, maybe throughout?
I think I certainly understood. There's another piece of me. When I got to Camp Lejeune in 1982, the Vietnam War had been over for 9 years. At least we had been out of Vietnam since 1973. But there were very few people who had been to Vietnam that I was interacting with. And of course, I'm a dentist, so I would see colonels and lieutenant colonels and other individuals. Very few people who had actually been to Vietnam. Now, that's 9 years later, but most of the people who had been to Vietnam had gotten out of the service. Now, there was a lot of senior Marines, enlisted and officer, who were available, but it just didn't seem to me that I was meeting that many. And as a dentist, and I'm a big talker, so I'm always interested in people's stories. What I realized was by 1983, there weren't many people who had been in combat or in these stressful situations. And I thought that one of the things that I had to offer in talking to people was to go over the psychological impact of mass casualty or people dying, because in our society, even in 1983, death and dying was something that you separated yourself from and walled yourself off from. And in situations where people die traumatically, people have to be shown to step up to the plate to do things, or wounded in that matter. And that's what I saw that one of my jobs was to tell people what they needed to do so that they could help the individuals who were wounded or the deceased, because it was such an abstract thing for them. I don't know if that's clear, but people in the old days, you would have a person who died in your family in your parlor. I mean, that's not unusual. I'm an Irish Catholic, and it's not unusual to hear stories about grandparents, even in the 60s and the 70s, they would be in somebody's house, for a day, So you got used to the death and dying piece, but now we are so far removed from it that people they need to be activated to help people who are injured or other things, because they're so far removed from it. And that's that combat experience. Nowadays, we obviously have many veterans who have all those experiences. But when I went out and talked about what my experiences were, I made an impression and tried to make an impression, especially on medical people, that if you're going to get help in a very bad situation, you've got to become the leader. You got to become the person that dictates to other people who aren't used to bleeding and injuries or death and dying. And that's, one of the things I would always stress when I talked about this to medical people, that they have to be aware that they have to become the leader in explaining what needs to be done. And throughout my military career, I seem to continually be involved with those situations. I spent a year in Kuwait at the Fleet Hospital there as executive officer. We medevaced over 1,000 people out of Iraq during that time frame, and medical issues. And then I was on the hospital ship as well, where I saw the Haiti earthquake, which was literally 10 times worse than what I saw in Lebanon, from the standpoint of how many people were in extremis. So I kind of learned to deal with that and learned to accept the challenges that I saw in front of me as a senior officer running field hospitals and combat hospitals.
And when you think of the legacy of Beirut and what happened there, and during the time that you served there, what do you think that legacy is, or what do you hope that the lessons are drawn by senior military leaders, by elected representatives when it comes to dealing with that part of the world, if you're to look at it through that lens?
You better be careful what you ask for when you get into a situation, because things change rapidly in the world. Because we see people one way, I think, in America, and Americans, we want to help people, but sometimes you can't tie the hands of the peacekeepers or the military individuals, because things can go sideways on them. I mean, that's what kind of happened to us. And we were the officers on the ground, and I was a naval officer, but I wasn't in the inner circle of the officers, but myself, I'll include Gil, and I'll include John Hudson. We all knew that the officer on the ground, who was our senior officer, was looking after the best interest of us. That was Colonel Garrity. He understood what his mission was, and he had a job to do. And he was caught between a rock and a hard place. And he basically, he carried out his mission to the very best that he could, because when somebody tells you, who's a diplomat, that you can't load a weapon in an area which is very vulnerable, unless you think you're under threat of attack immediately, and then that person has the authority of the president, you're put in a rock and a hard place. And so that diplomatic decision of the envoy to try to temper down our potential to make a mistake was a mistake. The Marines who were capable of defending us should have been allowed to not be so hamstrung. So I mean, I think that's in a nutshell, because we all realized that we were in a bad situation, and the orders from the top were very direct about how to avoid our conflict with other individuals. All that is what appears to me as a junior officer there, a lieutenant in the Navy. But anyway, I don't get hung up on that. But you asked me, so I'll tell you.
Yeah. Well, that was amazing, and I think that's probably a good way to wrap things up, with those lessons learned, and what a powerful story. And for me, I just want to thank you for your leadership during that time. I mean, you ended up running that rescue and recovery effort, and I don't think too many people know that story. So
there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of people who did a lot of courageous, heroic, and dangerous things. I just had one piece of the elephant. It was just my piece, and I had worked it before, and so but there's anybody who was there did their part. Everybody was doing their duty, and that's what it's about, really. They're doing your duty.
Yeah, so you went above and beyond and rose to the occasion, and I appreciate that. And all your time in uniform, you couldn't get enough. You had to stay in even after that.
I was around a long time. Yeah, I enjoy it very much. And today I've been out 12 years. I'm a children's dentist to do emergency services in my hometown, and I see 3,000 to 4,000 children a year. And so a lot of those years I was in the Navy, I was an administrator or in the senior leadership positions, but I wasn't doing clinical care. So I've gotten back to that, and I'm very happy at it. Now I just do work. But yesterday I saw about 32 children, and took care of the ones who had some real significant dental problems. So yeah, I'm still at it.
Jimmy, you're just an awesome guy. And I'll tell you, Jack and I both are so grateful. You've been so fantastic throughout this whole, our research, our writing process, all the questions, sharing your reports, photographs, your time, your countless commitment to this has just been.
Thank both of you for putting the story together for the families of the men who died there, the children and the grandchildren, really, and then to the men who were there with me, because we all know our story, and we all have told it on some occasions, but it's nice to have it put into paper, and everybody, and there'll be people who stories weren't told, and unfortunately, but I think you and I and Jack both know, if you were there, you contributed quite a bit, and you should be proud of that.
It's been an honor to tell your story and to tell the story of so many others. And we hope readers will, read the book, come back, listen to your podcast, hear it straight from you. Because, Jack and I've said all along, this is not our story, it's your story. And it's our privilege to get it out there for everybody. So thank you.
I'm going to go back to Jack for a minute. He's going to send you a video clip from Gone with the Wind, but you watch it. And
I will.
And I told James, if somebody asked me at a function or a party or something about, what it was like to be in Beirut after the bombing or be in Haiti, I just take them that clip and I say, just watch this. And that's about all I can say, because that's my exact memory of what I experienced in those situations. So it's one of those, I remember as a small child seeing that video clip not the video clip, the movie with my parents. And that stuck out to me when I was a kid, and then I lived it twice. So it's the scene in Gone with the Wind when Scarlett walks into the hospital in Atlanta, and first you just see people, and then you see the pan out and then you see the massive humanity. And what I think to myself on two occasions, whenever somebody asks me about, what was it like in Beirut after the bombing, or in my other situation, what was it like in Haiti after the earthquake? And basically, it's not the time or place to talk about it because it's such an emotional piece of my history. I just say, hold on, let me get this clip. And it's about 1 minute, 30 seconds long, but it shows Scarlett as she walks out. She's going to get the doctor to deliver a baby, but the doctor is in complete, the whole area is in chaos with all the bodies on the ground at the hospital in Atlanta. It's about 1.5 minute clip, but it sets the scene for me to say, that's pretty much exactly what it was like in both situations. So anyway, it just sets the scene for me to get in my mindset. As you've probably already seen, most of us who come and talk with you, we kind of have to get into the mindset of what happened 40 years ago. And I deal with that in a lot of different situations. So anyway.
Well, I watched that clip. I haven't seen that movie since I was 11 years old. I remember I was.
It's only 1.5 minutes, but you'll get it right away. You'll understand. It's not the surprise for Scarlett, but it's what you would do in that situation if you knew you were in charge, because no one else has stepped up to take the lead, and you've got a responsibility if you think of it that way. So anyway, it's pretty powerful. I think I think it describes what my experiences were in two situations. So
I'll be watching it for sure.
Absolutely. So, Jimmy, thank you again, man.
Okay, thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Take care. We'll see you soon.
See you, bud.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast. Be sure and pre-order your copy of Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror. You can pre-order wherever books are sold. You can find me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. OfficialJackCarr.com is the website. Click on shop in the upper right-hand corner for the merch. And if you got something out of this conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until the next time, take care out there. Stay safe. Be strong. Keep fighting.